Good morning and a good year. Hope everyone had a very meaningful and purifying Yom Kippur. So we continue our journey in Ayin Beis. The conclusion, the review of the conclusion based on everything we've learned, as we've reviewed a few times, that we're here to not just review it all, but also contextualize it with those maimorim that will help us fill in some gaps, especially the areas that the Rebbe Rashab never concludes at the end of the Hemshech. Both questions that he asked and topics that he began, that he never, at least to people on our level, cannot see how he concluded it. So by looking at the Maimorim that Ayin Beis is based on and studying them as we did over the past months, it'll help us understand that. And that's what we've been doing the last few months as well, reviewing primarily from page 1350 and we're going to go till the end with the main focus on understanding that general context, knowing that we learned this already a first time a few years ago when we ended the Hemshech in the first time around. So where are we? We are now on page 1406, the top of 1406. So let's sum up what we're learning. So things are starting to come together after he began on page 1350 about Teira Eir, which is in contrast to Mamatal of the interface from the bottom up through Tefillah, which really goes back all the way back in volume 2, close to the beginning of the volume, for over 550 pages, I would say even more than that, probably 600 pages, where he discussed primarily, I say primarily because there was plenty of Mamayla Lamata as well, or it was primarily the Aveda Mamata Lamayla. And then on page 1350, he said, Uma'ata, and now let's go to Teira, which is Teira Eir, Hamshacha Mamayla Lamata. So Teira and Tefillah, therefore, play a central role in general in Judaism, but in Ayin Beis, as two ways to interface, as he gave the example back in the beginning in volume 2, that when you want to have two people who are, one person's on top of a mountain, that's the exact example he uses, which is an example from the Alter Rebbe. And if someone's on the bottom of the mountain, there are two ways for them to meet. Either the one on top comes down or the one on the bottom goes up. But the key here is that they both meet in between, because you have both the Maila of Mamayla Lamata, the one from the top coming down, and the one from the bottom going up until they completely converge. And you have both qualities, that total interface that is both on the terms of the one below, which is us on earth, and on God's terms as he is above, uncompromised and undiluted and without any tzimtzum, from above down. And that's the combination of the two interfaces. So from page 1350, he began speaking about Teira. But in the process, so many details, we're now back to a place where he starts talking about Teira and Tefillah again, as I pointed out, and I'll elaborate now in a moment. I just wanted to go over some of the review. So he talked about Teira Eir, and that's when he introduced a few new questions, which most of them are not answered in Hemshech Ayin Beis, that are going to be necessary to build it ourselves based on what the Rebbe Rashab does say, and what is written in the original source material, namely Hamagbir L'Sheves of the Alter Rebbe and Teira Eir, and the Bir and the Mitler Rebbe's Maimer, and then the other Maimorim Veineinu Me'ires, and there's a few others that we will be discussing, as you'll see as we go along. And now the Maimer Yonossi is going to come into play from the Kutta Teira, and the Maimer Shchera Nivanova, and a few others that are all connected. We see the Rebbe Rashab taking together a bunch of Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe and the Rabbeim that followed, and bring it all together in this central theme. So he began with Hamagbir L'Sheves, the topic of Ner Mitzvah, of Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, Ner Mitzvah V'Teira, using Ner, the example of a candle, the three elements in a candle, which are the wick, the oil, and the light that it creates, and how that plays itself out in the neshama, the divine soul, the wick, immersed in the animal soul's oil, the intelligence of the animal soul, in order to convert it and transform it into fuel for Teira Eir, for the divine light of, first of all, the Haftas Hashem Elokecha, the love of God, B'chol b'shnei levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, B'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, also the Nefesh Habamis, and ultimately Teira Eir, for the light of Teira, which is an Eir Atzmi. And then he goes on to explain their mitzvah and then Teira Eir, and to understand all that, he said we need to understand Eir Hariyah, the power of vision, eyesight. And that led us into the discussion of the three levels of Eir Makabel, Eir Malchus, which is the eyesight, and the other two, moonlight and the luminous stone, which correspond to Mikra Mishnah Talmud. After a long explanation about all that, he comes back to understand the three Mashalim of moonlight, which is like Talmud, and in Bria, and the luminous stone is like Mishnah Yechida. And though he doesn't spell it out, then comes the third one, which is eyesight in Asiyah. And that's now the operative example, that the eye has two sides to it. One side is how the power of vision manifests in the physical eye, and there's limitations that the Klei Ha'ayin, the eye vessel, puts on the vision, that you cannot see in the dark, you can only see that far. But with an outside light, siyua, as he calls it, then the eye itself can see. What is that in the nimshal? That a neshama is like eyesight, and it gets its vision clarity from the guiding light of Teira through the Einei Ha'eda, the leaders, who are called the eyes of the people. So there too, those eyes of the nation, which is the leaders, starting from Moshe Rabbeinu and the Chachamim, they are using Teira. They need Teira Eir to illuminate the path for the people. So that's how. But then on the other hand, we have also Neshamas HaMashpiyah in Teira, and this comes now to the other side of the story. That's how the eyes receive light from outside in order for them to see in this dark world. But then, once the eyes see, the neshama actually is mashpiyah in Teira, and that's why the chachamim can actually go beyond Teira, and they can actually change things in Teira, as we learn, temporarily, or even not temporarily, but they have the power to be mekadosh hachedesh, things that in the sense that Hashem gave them power. Why? Because neshamas have an element that's higher than Teira, and the explanation for that is because there's two levels of the soul. There's the soul that is above Tahirahi, Atzilus, and higher, all the way all the way to Eirei Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, Tahirei Allah, and the neshama as it comes down inside the body, Ata Barasa, Ata Yitzarta, Ata Nefachta Bi. So when it comes down below, it is engaging with and manifests within the body and the animal soul. It gets congealed, solidified, more megushim by them, as well as concealed. So that's why they need the Teira, Yisrael, Miskashroim Baraisa, the neshama, the Yisrael below connects to Teira Eir, because Teira Eir does not retains its divine revealed level, and it in turn illuminates the neshamas and allows them to connect to Kutchebrichu, that's what Teira does. That's the neshama as it is below. And that's why the way we begin the prayer, and that connection to Teira accomplishes two things. First, it connects the gvul, the neshama, as it comes down into the finite parameters of the body and this world. It connects it to bli gvul. That's why Teira is Teira Eir, the bli gvul of all the way higher than all the simtsum. And then there's Teira as an interface that's like a simla, like a shirt, a garment, as it manifests and relates to the parameters of the world. Even though the Teira itself is, its midah is l'mayla min midah, as we learned, its measure is higher than measure, but the Teira manifests in a way that relates to the neshama below. So it's essentially connecting gvul and bli gvul. That's one thing. The second thing the neshama does, oiz b'teshia, it gives power to the divine soul to connect to the bli gvul, and teshia is from the word mateshes, it weakens the animal soul's resistance and the animal soul's shell, like he calls it, like the nut. It cracks its nut, it weakens its resistance. So therefore, the neshama can flourish, and the neshama can spread its wings even down below, as when it manifests in the guf and nefesh habamis. And we'll learn about that more later when we get back to the Hamagbi, the Maimer of Magbi, of how that exactly is accomplished. But I will say a few things about it in a moment. So then the next paragraph on page 1405 to where we're up to now, 1406, he said, and that's Taka the Seder Aveda. There's two steps. Just like we said, there's two levels of the soul, and there's two steps. One is that the neshama needs Torah, because Torah illuminates it, empowers it. So that's why when a person begins studying, like the Gemara says in Psachim, he brings Mikara initially, he ovid inish adaita the nafsh. He does it for the sake of his nefesh, because his nefesh, in a world where it's concealed in the divine, in the animal soul and the body and the animal soul, adaita needs to learn Torah to bind it, to connect it to Kudsha Brichu. The neshama mislepes beguf laKadosh Baruch Hu. That even when it comes down below, where it's defined and limited, and the eye cannot see in the dark, and it's darkened, the salma haguf makom mokim te'achuz v'kshura beis barach. Through Torah, nevertheless, it should be bound and it should have something to hold on to, bound and connected to Torah, through Torah to Kudsha Brichu. That's step one. So what do we see from there? That the nefesh needs it, the neshama needs it, the neshama needs Torah. But then once the neshama gets empowered and starts growing and elevating, then comes step two, where the neshama is going to be mashpia in Torah. So he says, Ach achakach tzarich li limud Torah l'shma. L'shma means l'shem Torah, not for the nefesh, not for the soul, in order for it to connect to Elokus, to godliness, which really includes both things, the gvul connecting to bli gvul and the weakening of the animal soul. But also, but now you reach a level of the Shem HaTorah. And he explains that in a very basic way and then in a deeper way. He says, what is the inyan? Because the Torah, as it comes down below, manifests in physical items. Like we know, talks about, like he said, Hamachlif Parah b'chameir, the exchange of an animal, of a cow for a donkey, Shnai Me'echzim Betalas, the Dal Rishuyas. These are all physical manifestations of Torah. And yet, Torah, Lamaila is ruchniisdik. So what do you need to, what does the neshamas do? The neshamas, as they learn Torah below, the second level, the Shema, they connect the Torah as it is lamato to the Torah as it is lamaila. That's the first thing the neshamas accomplish. Omnam yeshlem, and he says, L'shma, on a deeper, however, we can say L'shma really means something even more. L'shem HaTorah, that even as the Torah is L'mayla, we also mashpia, because then we'd say you'd only mashpia to the Torah as it comes down below. But the Torah as it remains above, Neshamas don't have any impact on it. He says, no, Neshamas have impact, even the Torah L'mayla, like it says in Sefer HaBoyer, that David HaMelech was mechaber the Eidens Elokus into Torah. In other words, neshamas bring a deeper level of the divine into Torah. So even though initially Torah did that for the neshamas, now the neshamas are repaying, so to speak. I'm using that word myself. It's not really repaying. The neshamas are doing exactly the same thing for Torah, but bringing even a higher level, because the nesherish of the neshama, the root of the neshama, is higher than Torah, and then it brings it down into Torah. And to explain that, he began to explain the Zoyar Estaka Baraisa Bara Alma, which I'll review in a moment. I want to just say a few things and just to add context to the whole picture here. So we're going to learn this later, but I want to say it here because I think it's helpful here. Remember in the previous page, he said that even though generally tefillah is mamata l'mayla, but based on what he's explaining here, Torah is also mamata l'mayla. Why? Because neshamas from below, what do? They connect to Torah. When we learn Torah, we're connecting to Torah through Torah to godliness. That's a mamata l'mayla, because the neshama is doing so as it is below in the guf. And in some ways, he said, in the parentheses, he said that you have to say this is kashrus is even higher than the one through tefillah. So I want to elaborate a bit more about that, because I believe it's going to be really relevant later. But it also connects to something we learned a lot earlier. In volume 1, if you want to look it up, in volume 1, chapter 176, he also spoke about Torah and Tefillah, and each one, what they do in the far as the connection, the interface between God and the human being. So we could say the following. Based on the Maimer Magbil L'Sheves, if you may recall, the first thing he said was that Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the neshama has three components to it, as I pointed out before. One is the wick, is the divine soul. The divine soul manifests and is inserted into the Guv Nefesh Habamis, so the lower level of the neshama clearly. But also Yitzhak, especially B'atar Nefachta Bi, that Nefesh Habamis is the intelligence of the animal soul, which initially is focused on its own interests, is the oil. And the mission is for the neshama to transform that oil to become fuel, not for self-interest of the animal soul, but for divine interest. And that's when, how does the Nefesh HaLekis do that? Through tefillah, davening. And we learned about Birchas Yetzer, and before that, we learned about Psukei de Zimra, the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. That all prepares to weaken the animal soul. So then, when it comes to Shema, so if you remember, Yetzer talks about the malachim that are the root, the shirish of the Nefesh Habamis. So it says they weaken the pnei sheir, which is the pnei of the animal soul that weakens the animal soul, preparing it for Shema, which is the contemplation of the soul through tefillah. It's contemplating on Achdus Hashem, Hashem Echad, both Yechida Ilah and Yechida Tata, and the joining of both of them, which we're going to learn later at the end of Ayin Beis, but it's also in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer at length. And that unity ultimately impacts the animal soul, that it should understand that it too is part of this bigger picture, and it is affected by it. It's tamed and ultimately transformed to what? What comes after Shema and Baruch Shem, which includes Yechud Ilah and Yechud Tata. Then it goes, after Hashem Elokecha, B'chol Levavcha, B'shnei Yitzarecha. So it affects that even the animal soul should also love God. So you love God with both sides of the heart. That's the neshama doing so through tefillah, mamata l'mayla, because the neshama is below. That's only where the neshama is impacted by the animal soul. This whole process is only because the soul is connected to the animal soul. Then later, he'll speak about, and you could say based on what we're learning here in Ayin Beis, he'll speak about ner mitzvah and teireh, how that helps the neshama achieve this. And even deeper levels. First the mitzvah, and then especially teireh, because teireh is an atzmi. So what you see from that is that the teireh is helping the neshama transform the animal soul. And now, based on what we're learning in Ayin Beis and combining that with Magbil L'Sheves, you see it all come together. But this is the first step. This is like he says in Teireh explicitly. First comes the neshama as it does it on its own. Then is the neshama with Ne'er Mitzvah and Teireh, which elevates it even more, elevates the animal soul even more so. So that's still step one. Now, one more point in step one. As I was looking through the sources of the material that we're learning here, came to realize that the Maimer Yainosi in Likutei Teireh, and the Tzemach Tzedek brings it, the Tzemach Tzedek that I'm going to soon cite, that's the basis of the next section about God looking into the Torah and creating the world. So there he says that in order to elevate there he says the following, in order to elevate the soul down below, to connect to godliness, is dafka through tefillah. Even to connect it to Torah also needs tefillah. And basically, there's the concept that before we daven, we learn Torah. The Torah is there helping the tefillah achieve its goal. And that Torah, he made it clear earlier in Ayin Beis in Volume 1, is the first level of Torah, that we're learning Torah in order to help the Nefesh HaLekis, Oiz LeNefesh HaLekis, strength for the divine soul, and Mateshes, Teshia, to transform the animal soul. In other words, the Me'ikara, that we first learn Torah in order for the Nefesh, Me'ikara Adaita the Nafsh, is that the Nefesh should connect to godliness. That's the first level. That's when the soul needs that connection, and Torah is helping Tefillah do this. So this he doesn't say explicitly in the Maimer Magbil L'Sheves, even though, let me correct myself, he does say it, but it's not so 100% clear until you connect it all together. So in other words, it begins with our effort, and that's why he says here that there's a Teda Mamat Lamaila here. Because the Teda before Tefillah is part of that Mamat Lamaila process. It's helping us connect as the Neshama is down below, Ata Nafachta Bi, and the Neshama needs that help in order to connect to godliness. So it does so through Teda and Tefillah. And Teda actually helps Tefillah. That's point one. Then comes the next step. Once you've achieved that level, then comes Teda after davening. So in volume 1 in Ayin Beis, he explained that Teda after davening is the second level. It's Teda L'Shma. Now you already dealt with the Neshama and the Guf and the Nefesh Habamis. And we already achieved Haftas Hashem L'Kecha B'chol Avavcha. Now comes the next step where Teda is becoming an entity of its own, and the Neshamas are being mashpia in Teda now. Before davening, the Neshama can't be mashpia in Teda because it needs Teda. It's still in a state of concealment. But Tefillah has brought alive the Neshama, and the Neshama has also affected the animal soul. So now both of them together can now feed Teda, so to speak, and inspire and bring higher levels of Elikus into Teda. So this is based on what he says in volume 1 and connected to what he says here, and Amagbila Sheves. As I said, I will talk about this much more later when we go back to reviewing the whole picture, but I thought it's fitting to insert it here. I'll just add one more point. In chapter 176 in volume 1, he said that there are two things, there are two milas. He asked, what's the mila of the iskashus of Teda, the connection to God through Teda over the iskashus through Tefillah? He says two things there in volume 1. The first thing he says is, I believe the first one is, because the first iskashus through Tefillah is more, what did he say? I can't remember now the first explanation. The second explanation is because Tefillah only connects it on our terms, which fits very well because it's completely a Mamat Lamaila, where Teda connects it on God's terms, Bligvul, basically. That's the second advantage. The first advantage, I think, is that discussions in Tefillah is not a complete union, whereas Teda completely unites us. Like we learned that Teda is more Gilui. As much as we achieve Mamata Lamaila, Teda has something, Teda Eir, of that comes all the way from the highest levels of Elikus. That comes after through Teda Eir. Now, one more thing to summarize, and then we're up to where we're up to. There's the next piece. He said to understand this inyan, but the first thing how the neshama is and the Teda is mashpia into the neshama, then the neshama into Teda. He brings the Zohar Truma Daf Kuf Samach Aleph. Now this piece I didn't mention in the last class, but this piece is based on a mimer from the Alter Rebbe. Well, actually, a mimer from Biyuri Azer, the Samach Tzedek, which is based on a mimer of the Alter Rebbe. And the interesting thing is that he already explained this Zohar earlier on chapters 164 in volume 1, but here he adds a few points that from that mimer. So what did we learn? So the Zohar has the statement that says that when God created the world, he first looked into Teda, and with that he created the world. Then it says Barnash, then comes the second half, that we look into Teda and V'koyim Alma, and we preserve the world. So here you see exactly how Teda is mashpia to existence. It's the blueprint of existence. And on the other hand, how the Barnash preserves the world through learning Teda. So the strength that the neshamas provides. So he explains, what does this mean? So briefly, here is very, very brief, but the mimer of the Samach Tzedek, which if we had the time, I'd probably learn it inside with you, because it's a fascinating mimer and very, very elaborate, relatively speaking. But briefly, what he says is, he asks a question there. He says, why, if God wrote the Teda, why does he have to look into the Teda to create the world? He himself wrote the Teda. So he answers, because existence, God wanted to create the world in a logical way. The world, existence, and God are two completely antithetical entities. The creator is beyond the infinite, and the world is a completely finite, mortal world. So he used the mamutza to do so. The mamutza is ak, and that's the level of Teda that he's talking about. Yes, there's levels of Teda that are higher, but istaka baraisa, kutshabrichu, istaka baraisa, bara alma, kutshabrichu is erein sav, that's higher than ak. That in turn looks into ak, the mamutza, the blueprint that God made that should serve like an interface. It's an klali, as he explains, where everything, the whole of existence is concentrated there like in a snapshot. And that's the mamutza between Ein Sof and Elamus. Because the world is made up of time and space. Well, he talks about time here, but in the Maimer in earlier in Ayin Beis, he talks also about mokim space, and therefore Elokus is higher than time, and Ak encompasses both. It sees all the details throughout all the generations till the end of time, but it's all in one snapshot, all in one concentrated moment. So it's a mamutza ben l'maylam azman v'azman. And he says, commission is Arich. I'm looking at the bottom of page 1405. That's chapter 164 and on in volume 1. And that's Istaka Baraisa Bara Alma, because the Torah too is structured the same way. The Torah is like Ak, Klal, and Prat. And the Klal of Torah is like the Kloli of Ak, and Kutshabricha, which is the Atzimus of Ein Sof. Pnimius Ak, that's higher even than the Kloli, Istaka Baraisa looks into this general, you could say, blueprint, and and then it can bring it out into detail, like an architect looks into a blueprint. The blueprint is the perfect interface, because on one hand it has the whole picture, other hand it has all the details in it, except they're still not built, but you can follow that, and that from that klal comes to the prat, maimer sas and maimer pasuach. That's the first step. That's how Torah. So that's the role that Torah plays, the interface, which of course we learned before is the neshamas need this Torah because it illuminates for them what path to take. So both creates the world and also guides us. Then comes the second half of the Zayar. Barnash mistaka baraisa v'koyim alma. So what do you see from this? 1 second. Why isn't the Torah mekayim alma? Since God created the world with Torah, and Torah is God's Torah, so the Torah preserves the world. Why did we learn earlier, for example, that God made a condition that if you don't have the neshamas being mekayim Torah, the whole world would disappear. So in other words, it's not just enough Torah, we need barnash to preserve the world. Why? Because neshamas have something that the Torah doesn't have. The neshamas, besides implementing Torah, neshamas Yisrael, ola b'machshava gduma da'ak b'mayl madrega yeser in primiyasak. Neshamas go back to Kutshabrichu. They're rooted in Kutshabrichu, which is higher than the blueprint of Torah. And that's why Mamshichim on page 1406, he says, Mebchinas atzmis eino shalamal gam b'chinas atera kamesh b'chinas klali. So what do you see from this? That the neshamas are being mamshich Ein Sof into Torah, like we said, Dover HaMelech. This is the second level of Torah, not that what Torah is doing for us, but what we're doing for Torah. That the neshamas, which are higher than Torah, mishpia and Torah. But that could only come after the first stage that we first receive from Torah, so Torah illuminates and guides us. Then we get empowered that the neshamas then could be in turn mashpia into Torah. And of course, mishpia into in preserving the world as in the process. And that's where we stopped. So this is somewhat of a summation with a little more explanation and contextualizing the ideas that we've learned. I hope everybody followed, because this is pretty fundamental in the bigger picture of Ayin Beis, and I connected a lot of different things here from volume 1 back to all the way where we are now, the Maimer Bahmagbil Sheves, and now, of course, the Maimer from the Beauty Azer, from the Tzemach Tzedek, that addresses all of this in detail. If you want to look up the Maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek, you can. It's on page 256 and on in Beauty Azer, volume 1. Okay.
I have a couple questions.
Go ahead.
The first one is, first of all, I hope you had a good Yontav and everybody else. Meaningful.
Thank you. Yes.
The first question is, when you say Istaka Baraisa, that the Eibishter looked into the Torah to build, to create the world, and you just explained it. So I'm not asking a question to try and ask you something that you just explained. I'm trying to simplify it. The question comes to try to simplify it. The pashtus, very simple layman's terms. as if I'm explaining it to someone who doesn't know almost any Chassidus. Um, can one say that essentially the Eibishter looked into himself? We talked about when we talked about the highest level of the Godhead, when the Atzmos, when God actually started to think about creating the world. The first notions of separateness, if you will, was within himself. The very thought that there might be something other than God happens within God himself. I think is a very simple explanation when we talked about that. And so my question comes to ask, and maybe this looking into the Torah is not quite at that level. That's like the very first spark of, if you will, or that's a terrible word, the very first notion of something other than godliness. But I mean, in that sense, and you, Ak is a very high level. So can one say to someone not learning in Kabbalah and all the different levels we say Rishtashas, that essentially the Torah exists, like Neshamas Yisrael exists. They're parts of the Yechida is part of Eibishter, and yes, as it comes down to the Guf, it's completely separate. We're separate beings, but looking at the Torah, he's really looking into that part of him that conceives of something other than himself. Is that a fair, I don't know, layman's summary?
I wouldn't put it that way. No.
Oh, okay. So it's still extremely perplexing. What does the Eibishter need to look into anything, to create anything? Or you're saying he's like a good builder, he'd draw out a blueprint first so that he has a general conception and then he implements his blueprint. Is it more like that?
That's correct. It's exactly like that. So let me just comment and say the following. Conflating a few things here that need to be separate, distinguished. The things you said, there's nothing you said that's fundamentally wrong. You just combined two things that I would not combine. There's one thing, Lifnei Tzimtzum, when you're talking about Atzmos and the levels of Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, there we talked about levels where there is Kaidem Alei Sarotzen.
Yes, exactly.
So let me explain. So and even higher than that. So first of all, we're not talking about Atzmus when we talk about that. Atzmus is beyond all this. Atzmus, we don't really, I always point out, we don't talk about Atzmus much. We talk about how Atzmus chose to start manifesting in, you can call it Erein Sof or Atzmus Ha'er, a field of energy. Because once you talk about Atzmus, you're talking about an undefined, built in Metzius, and it's a non-existential reality that is completely beyond. So we generally don't speak about Atzmus, except when Chassidus wants to, and then it will make it clear that it's talking about. So, but we talk about Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, yes, and there, even that, Arizal didn't speak much about. Yet Chassidus, one of the gifts of Chassidus is it does talk to us about that. Now, it's important to always qualify Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, because if it's Lifnei Tzimtzum, it means there's no room for existence. That's the whole point of the Tzimtzum. Eitz Chaim says that clearly. So when we talk about it, we're only talking about it really in very, we'll call it metaphorical terms, Shema Mushal. We're only talking about L'Shabbatas Ha'ezen is the expression. Because we have to have words, so we use some words. Because God wanted to reveal to us what's going on, so to speak, in the, if you wanted to call it a Godhead, fine. You can call it the engine room, however you want to define it, because it's really not definable. But you could speak about it in very, very abstract and subtle terms, that there's the levels before that is even arose in the desire, then there's a rising in the desire, then there's in that itself, I don't know if you recall, but we learned many levels. There's generally 3 levels there, but then there's breaks down into even more. We learned in the Hemshech Tzadik Daled and the end of volume 2. I don't want to go into it now because it's not going to help at all, just confuse matters. But then comes that's all before the Tzimtzum. That's where you speak about the language. Is the Eir Legalis La'atzmai, like Machshava, like the light that shines for himself, Eir Legalis La'elamis, the light that he's allocating for existence. Like we say, Shir Atzmai B'Koyach. So that's generally before the Tzimtzum. We're going to talk more about before the Tzimtzum and those higher levels soon when he talks about Neshamas. But what he's talking about now, as soon as you say Ak, you're talking about after the Tzimtzum. So now after the Tzimtzum is a whole other story now. Now God has begun the process of actual creation. And that also doesn't happen like that. Remember, as I've said many, many times, God could do anything he wants. He doesn't need any levels. He doesn't need any blueprints. He doesn't need any oir. But then existence would not make any sense to the seichel that we have today. Now, why our seichel works the way it works today, that we don't have an answer for. This Alter Rebbe uses an expression somewhere that says that based on the seichel, the way God wanted to create seichel demands that things make sense. That a seed doesn't grow into a tree overnight. And a baby is not from conception to birth, takes months of gestation. That makes sense to us. So we talked many, many times that the reason there's a Seder Shtalshlus, there's a reason there's all these levels, is not because God needs it, but because God wants to create a world like ours. We should be able to understand his process. He could have just made that a baby is just born and that's it. Husband and wife get married, they come home and they have a baby without doing anything. He could have made that seeds don't grow into trees. Trees are just there, and that's that. But he wanted a process. The second reason for the process, as I've discussed many times, is for us to retrace the steps and reconnect. And if we didn't have a step-by-step process, how would we climb? We are defined creatures. We're finite creatures. We can't just jump from B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Meidecha, and from a mundane weekday into Ne'ilah Yom Kippur. We have five prayers and stages. It's a journey. Everything's a journey in the Torah. Lech Lecha, the journey through the 40 years of the wilderness, the journey through Golus to come to Mashiach. Everything is a process. So in order for that process to manifest, there has to be a logic. That's why you have interfaces in the first place. That's the whole reason for an interface. God doesn't need an interface. We need an interface. And for us, it makes sense. Once God uses an interface, now we say, he made it like that. First, he made a klal. Then he made a prat. First, he said, Bereshis bara Elokim hashamayim v'saaretz. As Rashi says, everything was created, but all in a concentrated nucleus, like in a seed. And then, Yehi Oyer on day 1, Yehi Rakia on day 2. He needed 6 days to create. He could have created it all like this. And look around. If you can't create, it won't help you 6 days. And if you could create, you can do it in a split second. So the point being is because he wanted a process. So as such, what's the process? Tzimtzum. After Tzimtzum, what's the first step? A klali called Ak. Or if you wish, Torah as an klali, which is that level of Ak. And now we talk about Kudshe Brichu looks into Torah and creates the world. So the three things, Kudshe Brichu, looking into the Torah and the creation of the world. This is all after the Tzimtzum. We're not talking about Kudshe Brichu before the Tzimtzum. We're not talking about Atzmus now. We're talking about already Kudshe Brichu as he chose to create and be a creator. Remember, he's not even defined by being a creator. And here we have Pnimius Ak, so to speak, is looking into Chitzenius Ak, the Klali, the blueprint which he himself wrote, and says, Yehi Oyer, okay, Vahi Oyer. And from there, we take from the Klal and we create Oyer. We create Rakia, we create Demem Sameach Chaim Medaber, and the whole multitude of creation as we know it. Now, a human being, the neshama also comes down below. The neshama is also rooted in higher levels, all the way to Pnimius Ak, like he says. Now, you could ask, what about the neshamas before the Tzimtzum? We'll talk about that soon. I don't want to jump. Right now, he's explaining it on this level. As I explained many times, he'll explain things. Even Atzilus, the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe, trembled, couldn't even say the word Atzilus, let alone Ak, let alone Lifnei Tzimtzum. We've got used to all these words. For us, it's one big thing. Atzmus, Lifnei Tzimtzum, Ak, Kav, Ak, Akudim, Nekudim, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzida. It's words. But if you really understand the significance of it, Ne'ilah is not Shachris. Ne'ilah is Yechida. Now, for us, you have to be on that level. I'm just pointing out. But if you're on the level, you understand that Ak is after the Tzimtzum, is that place, that interface. That's the bridge, so-called the platform where everything's taking place. So Kudshe Brichu looks into Torah, creates the world. Parnash, the neshamas which are rooted in Pnimius Ak, in Kudshe Brichu now look into Torah and preserve the world because they're drawing from a level that's higher than Torah, the Klali of Torah. This is the way I would just explain it in this context.
That was phenomenal. Wow, that was tour de force. The second question is a lot simpler. You mentioned a mimer of the Alter Rebbe that began to talk about I guess the connections between the Shamas and Torah, I think is what the topic was. But
Yoinosi.
yeah, did I post the correct link in the WhatsApp group?
Let me
Is
look.
Is it from Shira Shirim?
Shira Shirim. Yeah, there's 3 Maimorim there.
Can you look at the one I posted? 15.
I'm looking right now.
Okay.
What you just posted sounds to me Ayin Beis.
No. Look at the second one. The first post is the beginning of chapter 176 in.
Okay. I got it. Yeah, it looks right. I'm clicking on the link. Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks right. Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's the mimer. Yeah,
okay,
that's the mimer. And there's more. You have to look in Biur Azeh. As I said, I'm writing up something that's going to do a lot of what we're learning. I'm writing it up in Hebrew, a bunch series of essays. So they'll all be in there as well.
Wonderful. Oh, you're gonna do what's gonna be Memukad, annotated?
I'll write it first in Hebrew for plain, and then it could always punctuate it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, anybody? Now, keep in mind another thing I want to just say, which I think is important. I always talk about microcosm, macrocosm. When you talk about, when we speak about applying it all to our lives, Chassidus applied, and Avodah. And I've been asked many times by many of you the question, I myself addressed it. How do we apply all this to us? Are we on this level of Ak and Tahirahi and so on? I mean, some people will just say, listen, I'm barely making it day to day to fight with my animal soul. And here we're talking about all these high levels and so on and so forth. Which you could say the same thing about Yom Kippur, which is coming from Ne'ilah, Yechida. Like one guy came over to me by Ne'ilah and said to me, I barely can figure out my nefesh. And he told me we're ready by Yechida, meaning the first level of the nefesh, ruach, neshama. The answer is, you have to keep in mind, like the story with Rab Zusha. He was once sitting and crying in a corner. And they said, why are you crying? So he said, I'm crying not because they're going to ask me why I wasn't like Avram Avinu, or why I wasn't like Moshe Rabbeinu, or why I wasn't like the Rebbe. I'm going to cry because they're going to ask me why I wasn't like Zusha. I didn't live up to my own potential. We have to realize that when Chassidus talks about all these subjects, it's talking to everyone, to you, to me, to all of us. The Rebbe learned Ayin Beis just like you and I are learning. I mean to say the same text. Just like a Rebbe learns a pasuk in Chumash, like you and I learned the pasuk. However, each person has to personalize it and customize it according to where they are. And that's the beauty of Torah. When it says in Tanya, the Tanya is all based on one pasuk. Karev elecha hadavar ma'ed b'ficha b'vav chalasese. Who's elecha? Karev elecha. That's what Moshe is saying in Dvarim and Parsha Nitzavim. Who's this elecha to you? The answer is, when you're reading, it's to you. To you, to me, each one of us. So yes, we all read the same word, but remember, by Matan Torah, it says in Medrash, everything is Lashon Yachid. It doesn't say Anochi Hashem Elokeichem. When you speak to a group, it should have said, I am your God, your plural. Why say Elokecha? It should say Kabed Esavichem. Because there were millions of people there. All of them have fathers and mothers. It should have said Lo Signavu. That's what you say to in plural. So the Medrash says, because every person standing by Matan Torah heard it as if I was the only person there. It's like God speaking to you and no one else is there. Even though there were people there. But the way it was experienced, I remember Rabbi Sachs, the late Rabbi Sachs, once said, when the first time he got his first pulpit as a rabbi in England, so he gave credit to the Rebbe. Because he said he was a college student studying philosophy, and as the Rebbe said to him, why don't you go into rabbinics? That way your philosophy can be used for something instead of just talking about abstract philosophy. And he said the Rebbe convinced him and he gave credit, the first speech he gave,
He said, the Lubavitcher Rebbe in New York, I was a student back in 1970, whatever it was, 69, I remember what year. So a woman came over to him after his speech and said to him, what's the difference between a Rebbe and a rabbi? You know, you were elected rabbi, now you're appointed rabbi. And he talked about the Rebbe. So he said, you saw it here tonight. The difference is this. He says, when a rabbi speaks, he could be speaking to 50 people and everyone thinks he means somebody else. When a Rebbe speaks, he could be speaking to 5,000 people and everyone thinks he's speaking to him. He says, that's the difference. Because it's personal. The point being is that Anoich Hashem Elokecha, and the same thing we learn Chassidus, meant to be customized, personal to you. Everyone has Yechida. No one's comparing notes. Your Yechida to the Rebbe's Yechida, or your Yechida to my Yechida. Everyone has to figure out b'chol avavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha, relative to them, and that's perfectly fine. This is not a competition. It's not a marathon. It's not a comparative study. Every person has a neshama, and every morning you say neshama shenasata b'tahirahi, and he made it clear tahira is atzilus ak, all the way to tahira ilah for the tzimtzum. So that's your neshama. Now you'll say, how does it apply? Well, if you go a little out of your comfort zone, more than you did yesterday, for you, that's b'chol meidecha. For someone else, that may not be b'chol meidecha. Someone who learns Torah 5 hours a day, for him to learn 5 more minutes is one thing. For someone who learns a minute a day, or doesn't learn every day and starts learning 5 minutes every day, that's a big thing. Like he says in Tanya chapter 15, it's all it says Ovid Hashem, a servant of God, is someone who is constantly going out of their comfort zone. That if not, it's lo yavode. He needs to be called. It's called an eved. Eved is a person who's constantly working and going out of their comfort zone. Even someone who learns 100 times the same chapter, if it's their habit or routine, it's not a Veda. So everything is relative. In that context, when you think of Yechida Ishtalshelus, you could talk about these levels that we're talking here of the Tahirihi, Ata Baras, Ata Yatzat, Ata Nefaktabi. You could talk about it in the world of Asiya. There's also a Yitzira within Asiya, and there's also Bria within Asiya, and there's also Atzilus within Asiya. So all these levels can talk about a microcosm and macrocosm. So relatively speaking, when we're learning Torah, there's the step where we're looking to Torah to so-called quench our thirst and allow us to connect to godliness. And then there's where we are mashpia in Torah. Even a simple Jew can be mashpia in Torah. How if it's relative to after davening, where he was received from Torah, now he's going after a person, let's say, in practical terms, a person, let's say, studied Torah, it inspired them, and they go ahead and teach it to someone else. That's a form of being mashpia in Torah, because you're taking Torah and you bring it to other people. The Torah could not do that on its own. It's like we say about Simchas Torah. The Torah can't dance. We can make it dance when we dance with our feet, which means that neshama is mashpia in Torah. At the same time, that throughout we're also receiving from Torah in stage 1, going back to those two things. So it's all relative. You have to find, and that's the challenge, to find it where I can apply it to my personal life and to those those around me. So and while we're also learning it, and obviously we can't sit here and personalize it all the time. Personally, everybody has their own journey here. So we learn it inside, but we have to always remind ourselves that's really the kavanah of all this learning, is to you to personalize it. I try to explain it in a way that everybody can then take it and say, okay, here's how I can apply it to my personal situation, wherever you may be. Everyone's in a different place. And we're not asked or expected to do avodah of somebody else. You're doing your avodah. I just wanted to add that into the... I hope that was helpful.
Extremely and very beautiful.
This is what's called between the lines, like the givens, the assumptions or givens and axioms, even before you learn, just to know this. The Rebbe Rashab, once in a while, maybe in a Maimon you may find these words, but generally speaking, this is something that I can tell you, whatever I teach or learn, I'm always thinking about what I just said the last few minutes here. That's always like an undercurrent of everything. But at the same time, you want to read the text because you want to know what it says. So and then you can apply it. Okay, good. Anybody, any other question? Maybe this is a post-Yom Kippur inspiration coming from the new year.
Wonderful. Yeah, you got the fuel tank got refueled a little bit.
Well, it's interesting that, on Ne'ilah, we experience that thing that we can experience the rest of the year, but that must give us the strength to be able to then push forward and go past our comfort zones because we had that planted within us that day. I don't
Exactly
know.
Right. I'll just tell you what I told this guy that was telling me he's only holding by nefesh. I said to him, look at it this way. Now's Ne'ilah, and I don't know what happened when you were at the nefesh level by Ma'ariv or Kol Nidre, but you have to look at what you have right now. You have now a moment of truth. We all need a moment of truth in our lives. Whether we can sustain it and integrate it is another story. That's the next challenge. A moment of truth where you just step back, you try to push aside all the camouflages and masks and all the defenses and all the other stuff that we so often surround us with the smoke screens, and just go to a moment of truth. You're standing, you and God, nothing else, like a newborn child, and that's how you have to see it. Anyway, just after the service, Yom Kippur ended, the guy came over to me and said, I really want to thank you. It was really transformative because that's exactly what I did. And that was that. Sometimes you just need a certain language to trigger the sense, resonating element of it, because it can be so abstract. Yechida, what does it even mean? If you don't know, you can get into all the esoteric dimensions of it, and sometimes it just comes down to something. You just need language that speaks to you, that really cuts to the heart and soul of it. Just pointing out, just happened last night. Okay. And how appropriate that we're learning exactly about the Yechida now. The next few lines, I mentioned this in the class before Yom Kippur. So let's read. I know did a pretty big review today, but hey, let's read inside. So I'm on line 2 on page 1406. Unless somebody wants to ask anything, I'm happy to take further questions. Okay, so now he's going to explain this further. What exactly is going on here? Where are the neshamas? Where's Torah? So there's a little geography going on here too. What I mean by that, I don't mean it in a technical way. I mean to say he's going to place levels. We talked about Ak. So far we talked about Primius Ak, Chesenius Ak, and then Elamus and Kutchabrichu, and the Shamas are rooted in Primius Ak, Torah is in Chesenius Ak. So he's now going to explain further this level of neshama. This is based again on the Biurei HaZeir I mentioned. The Biurei HaZeir of the Tzemach Tzedek, that is the basis of what we're learning here. But the Rebbe Rashab, you see here, he really develops it a lot more. When you look at the Tzemach Tzedek, this really helps understand the Tzemach Tzedek more. So he says, Va'inyan hu. Second line, 1406. The pages can be found if you want to follow the text at ayinbeis.com. Just for the record, since you posted Yenosi, so he mentioned the Maimer Yenosi on page 1403 and 1404. So there's Arichus. That's why I think it's a fundamental. And then again in 1404. Okay. So he says like this, Va'inyan hu. This is a very fundamental Eitz Chaim, Arizal. Says like this. So we're talking now, getting to the, what is the soul exactly? Sheyesh nitzutz kotem ma'ed. There is a very small spark, shubchinas elikus, which is elikus, is divine. In other words, it's not a created entity. It's not like Daimam Sameach Chai or even Medaber as a created entity. It's elikus. And where does it come from, this spark? Nimshach, it extends from, or it's transmitted from, Madrega ha'achreina shebebeira. From the lowest level of the Creator. We'll soon talk about what means Madrega ha'achreina exactly. V'zeh hanitzutz. This is all the Eitz Chaim. And this spark, once it, in other words, it's like think of a flame, would be the Madrega ha'achreina shebebeira. From there, a spark emitted. And v'zeh hanitzutz, and this spark, mislabeshes, b'koyach nitzutz echad nivra. It then gets enclosed, the spark, which is divine, and coming from the body of the Creator, then manifests and enters, mislabeshes, like a lavush, enters into a spark nivra, nitzutz echad nivra. So now it's coming into creation. It doesn't remain where it is. It actually enters into nivra. So this is the basis of what we say a neshama, not yesh, neshama shenas, a lakush shenase yesh. There's sometimes an expression of Chassidus. When it says that God created the human being in the divine image, what does that mean exactly? Think about it. Didn't he create everything in his image? I mean, where does a stone come from? Where does the sky come from? Where does a rainbow come from? Where does an animal come from? When you say created in his image, it means it has something of the divine personality. A stone is a divine creation, meaning a creation of the divine. Like an artist created art. And obviously, Eined Milvade, and godliness completely permeates and encompasses all of existence. There's no so-called outside entity. We just feel outside because the Tzimtzum conceals the divine energy. But the creation itself is not necessarily a reflection of pure godliness. It's a reflection of what the artist wants. Now, the truth is, even a stone reveals to us things about God, but not quite. A neshama is God like a child. Like he says in Tanya chapter 2, God is giving part of his genetic material, kavyachol. I'm just using that as an example of a parent and a child. An artist creating a piece of art is not like an artist giving birth to a child. The child is a piece of him. That's a whole different story. That's Elokus. And he's explaining the dynamics of that. So the nitzutz echad of the Beira, meaning from the daga achrena, kinas achrena, madrega achrena, now manifests in the nivra. So now you have, in the creation, had God not created a human being and the neshamas, there was no vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. It's the only verse that says that. All other creation, it says God created light, he created the heaven, he created vegetation, he created the luminaries, he created animals, fish, birds, and so on. Only once he says that God took earth, dust from the earth, shaped it, and then vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, and he blew into it. He breathed into it a life, a soul of life. But everything has a soul of life. But here it's unique, because he's putting vayipach, like he says in Tanya, Ayin Beis, dibur, everything else was created with speech. Speech does not require you putting from your very guts, from your very essence. When vayipach means meteche yusei umepnimi yusei, like he says in chapter 2. What does that mean, Baruchnius? That it's a piece of him. He wanted something divine in creation that is a divine ambassador, a divine agent, not just a divine piece of art, not just a divine product. That's all of creation, but a divine entity that walks and talks, but it has a divine element, a godly side to it. That godliness can reveal the godliness in all of creation. That's the point. Stone cannot reveal godliness in a tree. At best, it follows the program God created it for. That's it. A human being, a neshama, comes down because it's the koyach nitzutz of the what he calls again elikus. Now nitzutz cotton me'ed, which is elikus, which manifested inside of nitzutz echad nivra. And yesh leimer, he says in the parentheses, when you say nivra, he says kamoi sha'ak nikra adam debriya. Remember ak. We said before the neshama is primius ak. Ak is called adam debriya because ak is already the nitzutz as it's manifesting in nivra, but it has an element of elikus in it. And then continue. The Eitz Chaim hasn't been finished. There's one more line, two more lines. Shehi neshama daka b'ma'od, that this nitzutz echad nivra, which this spark of the divine creator, that manifests in the slapsha, in the small in the spark, in this one spark of the creation, of a creator, of a creation, of a creature. This is a neshama daka b'moed moed. This is a soul that is very, very subtle, very, very sublime. Moed moed, he says. Hanikra Yechida. And this is what's called Yechida Shebenefesh. Ubenitzad zeh Hanikra Yechida. And in this spark, which is called Yechida, yesh b'sharshe dalet b'chinas. That includes within it the root of 4 levels: Chaya, Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. Ad kan l'shene. That's exact quote straight from Eitz Chaim, from the Arizal, telling you that this is the closest you're going to get to a full description of the ingredients, if you wish, of a neshama, where it comes from and what happens to it as it moves into existence. Okay. Quite a powerful piece. And, we talk so much about Yechida. And it's fascinating that we're literally learning this a day after Yom Kippur. Again, Ashgacha Pratis. We learned about Rosh Hashanah right before Rosh Hashanah, now Yom Kippur. So I guess the Rebbe Rashab is affirming that he's with us here. So, any questions on this piece? And I'm very excited by reading this. I don't know about you.
This is very beautiful Ashgacha practice. But it makes me think also, ask myself, what in everyday life, how do we access our Yechida?
That's what I spoke about before. That each one of us has to find a way to understand Yechida. I mean, I called it yesterday to someone moment of truth. Yechida is the closest thing you'll ever be to God. Let's put it that way. Nefesh is the biological life of the soul. Ruach is the emotional. Neshama is the intellectual. Chai is more the transcendent. And like the makif. And Yechida liyachdacha. Yechida is when that moment. I'm sure everybody has moments like this in their lives. By ne'ilah, by when we say Shema, we're supposed to be in that mode where you put everything aside. It's only you and God, and nothing else matters. It's not easy to hold on to, but it's that type of connection that that sometimes comes to us. Sometimes we have to work on it. I mean, I'm just putting it in my own words, but I'm sure everybody can find different words. That that moment where you're completely naked, completely vulnerable, and it's just you and God, and that's it, without any manifestation, not intellect, not emotions, not actions. It's just a pure connection like that. Like, when a person has an epiphany, that moment, a magical moment where they changes their lives forever. And you never look back. There are those type of moments. That's the key. Is trying to connect, trying to trigger that type of connection. I think it takes work. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. That's just my quick off the bat, fast description in Aveda of what we're talking about here. But again, everyone here can find different ways to express it, I'm sure.
I meditate, transcendental meditation every day, and what you're saying, because maybe that's what it is. Maybe sitting in deep meditation, because there's no emotion.
That is the general process, but the question is how far the meditation takes you. You're saying it takes you to that level? Maybe. I'm not going to say not.
Well, there are different ways to get there too. Like you said, Rabbi, you could do like do and have a conversation literally with Hashem and spend time really doing soul searching, which is what it is, I guess.
But that's intellectual. Then if you're soul searching, you're thinking with your mind.
The emotions come into it too, I think.
So that's not Yechida, Rabbi. So it's not
Yeah,
an
I mean,
intellect.
I don't know if there's a definitive, like, like God. I don't want to compare lahavdil. It's not like baking a cake and you got the cake perfect. I think Yechida can be experienced in many different ways, and different times and different moments. It all depends. If you really personalize it, I don't think it's like if I describe my Yechida experience, would that help you find yours? Not necessarily, because everyone has where they are and what their place and what their moment, that moment. And also each of us, depending how much work we've done, how much have we stripped ourselves of our conscious, defined and deterministic selves. Many of us, most of the time we're living on a survival mode, so we're living on functionality mode. Yechida requires, going deeper and deeper. I'm sure each of us have done work in that regard, but it all depends how much work you've done. Some people, unfortunately, through terrible distress and pain and suffering, have reached very profound levels of Yechida that others have not. I'm not saying it's the only way to go, but sometimes that way, because when you lose, when you like, you have nothing to. What's the expression?
You got nothing to.
When you have nothing to lose, type of thing. That in a point where you come, where really your pride, your look, your image, how others think about you, completely meaningless. Where you've gotten to a place of truth, that I've seen that. I've often seen it, unfortunately, by people who suffered a lot, like especially recovering people in recovery, addicts and so on, who really hit rock bottom, and they came to some type of clarity that is enviable. God forbid, I wish it didn't have to come that way, but there's something like that, and sometimes people come to it maybe through tremendous joy, and if you married off a child, I remember when I married off 2 children, and I remember a certain type of experience like that that day was not prepared for. I didn't like plan it. Some things happen at the moment. I guess it's a moment of birth of a child as well. And that I'll never know. But the mothers here that have given birth to a child, a certain, I don't know if the word is euphoria or peace. When you see the moment of a miracle where you're completely humbled and ego is gone and everything is gone. It's just you and a certain truth. And it doesn't always last. As much as it happens, it doesn't always last consciously. I mean, I'm just using some examples that I've heard from people that have experienced deep moments of love, profound love.
Rabbi, can I remind you your own teaching when you said, when we are not controlling that senses, when we are in the zone and we cannot reach that level from our side, it's coming to us. This is your teaching.
I appreciate it. You're correct. I do say that a lot. I don't know. I've been trying to be maybe a little more original now, but you're right. Being in the zone where you suddenly, you could try, and suddenly you're in the zone and you're channeling something higher than yourself. I've experienced it quite a few times in writing, when speaking, that you suddenly lose like yourself and you're just a channel. You can't always prepare for it. You can do a lot of things and try all your gimmicks, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it happens when you get at the highest moment of frustration, where you think there's not going to be a breakthrough, and then suddenly it breaks through. That's why you have to keep hammering at. You count 49 days, and the 50th emerges like that. You can't count the 50th. That has to come. But you plant the right seeds, and then something emerges. It's a process and an emergence. That's what I always say. That's the key. You can't pull a flower out of the ground. You water it, you do what you got to do, you plant the seeds, you water, you nurture, and then it grows. Yeah. Okay, well.
I have few ideas about application of what you just said, but I will leave it after we will finish the recording. It's really very interesting. In the research of Japanese science that got the Nobel Prize about the eye, anatomy of the eye. But I will leave it after the class.
Okay. I think I'm going to stop here simply because there's a lot to process here. And I could continue, but it's I'd rather go a little slower than faster here because of the density of it all. You're going to explain now further this neshama, this Yechida thing level. And comparing it to Torah. So this is pretty fundamental stuff here where we're at right now. I think that's a good idea to stop here. So we're stopping here. I'll stop at the fifth line. Is it fifth? Yeah, the fifth line. Top of page 1406. We read the Eitz Chaim, and we're going to explain it in the next classes. Remember, there'll be a class tomorrow, Monday and Tuesday, but not Wednesday, till Tuesday, after Simchas Torah, because I'm in California. So I'll give you more information as we go. So basically, almost 2 weeks off. We'll miss each other. Yes. Okay, let me stop here.